Welcome, everyone, to the battle over Line 5, the legal fight for our public waters, a community conversation for residents of Mackinac Island, the Straits Area, and beyond. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of Flow for Love of Water, a Great Lakes Water Law and Policy Center based in Traverse City, Michigan, and I will be your moderator today. I'd like to begin our engagement by sharing a land acknowledgement. For Love of Water is located on lands historically occupied by the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the sacred lands and waters of all Indigenous peoples and their continued presence. And now I am delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with our partners at the Bay Mills Indian Community and the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign. This is the 7th summer that Flow has hosted an educational conversation for Mackinac Island, the Straits Area, and beyond. While we miss seeing you in person, we are delighted to be able to reach you through this free webinar supported with a grant from the Mackinac Island Community Foundation's Natural Resources and Preservation Fund. The City of Mackinac, along with local families, businesses, and organizations, have raised their voices and led the way on Line 5, with the city passing a resolution back in 2016 to shut down Line 5. This takes courage and conviction, and we appreciate you and all that you've done to protect the Great Lakes and a way of life here for the benefit of all Michiganders and visitors. Our shared efforts have earned us the chance to shut down Line 5. First, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We're video recording this 75-minute session, and we will follow up by email with a link to the recording and other related materials. We will hear initially from our 3 co-panelists who will provide legal and other insights on the past, present, and future of the 68-year-old oil pipelines in the Straits of Mackinac and Enbridge's proposed oil pipeline to replace them. And then we will end by having our panel respond to questions submitted by you as attendees using the Q&A button found near the bottom of your screen. And you can use it to submit your queries at any time during the webinar. We'll also be taking questions via Facebook Live from Flow's Facebook live feed. And finally, we'll use the chat box to share links to key resources with you throughout the session. Now, with that, let me introduce our panel, and then I'll set the context for today's conversation. We have had to make a change on our panel as Flow's Jim Olson and Bay Mills President Whitney Gravel were unable to join with us today. I am delighted to introduce you to Skip Press, Flow's legal advisor and former director of Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth. Welcome, Skip.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Christopher Clark, supervising senior attorney at Earth Justice, representing Bay Mills Indian Community. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Liz.
And Sean McBryde, campaign coordinator, Oil and Water Don't Mix, and legislative and policy director at the Michigan Clean Water Action. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all. I'm going to just give a little more context and then turn over the program to you all. Last summer, exactly a year ago, Line 5 was shut down under court order. Michigan's Attorney General Dana Nessel had secured a temporary restraining order that shut down Line 5 for 82 days based on evidence of Enbridge's own contracted ship causing anchor and cable strikes to the pipelines that dislodged structural braces on the lakebed floor. Anchor strikes to this aging and vulnerable pipeline are considered a leading risk factor triggering a Line 5 disaster, according to the state's 2018 Independent Risk Analysis report. We don't know how often anchor strikes have occurred over the 68 years. However, back in 2018, in April, there was another anchor strike, And just last week, Enbridge announced that it found a 15,000-pound anchor abandoned on the lakebed floor adjacent to the pipelines. On Monday, Enbridge notified Michigan's Eagle that it had retrieved the failed shackle and anchor that its contractor left on the Straits lakebed when the coupling failed. How it got there and what damage it may have caused to the pipeline still remain unanswered questions. 11 years ago, almost to the day, on July 25th, 2010, Enbridge's Line 6B oil pipeline burst west of Michigan, and serves as an example of what the National Transportation Safety Board deemed a, quote, complete breakdown of safety, unquote. Through a series of bungling missteps by employees in its control room about 1,800 miles away in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, Enbridge stopped and restarted Line 6B's pump more than once over the next 17 hours, dumping more than 1 million gallons of heavy tar sands into the Kalamazoo River watershed. To date, it remains one of the largest inland oil spills in US history. Fast forward today, and Enbridge's 68-year-old pipeline Line 5, a quarter century older than Line 6B, snakes across the open waters of the Straits of Mackinac, pumping nearly 23 million gallons of oil and natural gas liquids a day through the very heart of the Great Lakes. Past its life expectancy and propped up to extend by its failing design, Enbridge Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac is a clear and present danger, posing an unacceptable risk to the public trust. And in the words of the Michigan Attorney General's office, Line 5 is an environmental time bomb. Since we gathered last year, Line 5 has finally been brought under the rule of law with the historic decision of Governor Whitmer to shut down Line 5 under the public trust doctrine to protect the Great Lakes from a catastrophic oil spill. On November 13th, 2020, the state of Michigan revoked and terminated the Line 5 easement that Enbridge relied on to operate its Line 5 pipelines in the Straits of Mackinac. This historic action represents a decisive initial victory for the Great Lakes and the citizens and tribes of Michigan, and recognizes that alternatives to Line 5 exist for supplying oil and propane while also meeting our urgent climate change goals. What's unique about this pipeline is that it occupies public trust waters and bottomlands held in trust by the state of Michigan for the benefit of current and future generations. That means that the state has a perpetual sovereign duty to protect the paramount interests and uses of these navigable waters and lands over private interests like Enbridge. The state of Michigan, its people, and the tribes must remain vigilant until the oil stops flowing for good, because Enbridge is defying the May shutdown order, and Line 5 remains exposed to exceptionally strong currents, lakebed scouring, new anchor and cable strikes, and corrosion. What's clear so far is that a persistent, well-organized, and well-informed coalition of people like you is critical to maintaining the best of Michigan and the Great Lakes. And it shows that public officials who look beyond the moment can take action with significance for decades to come. Now it's time to turn things over to our panelists, and I am very honored to introduce Skip Press, who is a legal advisor to Flow and an energy expert with decades of experience in both the public and private sector. Skip is a former cabinet member and director of the Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth, as well as the former chief energy officer for the state of Michigan under former Governor Jennifer Granholm, where he was responsible for designing and implementing Michigan's clean energy economy diversification efforts. Early in his career, Skip served as deputy director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the assistant attorney general in charge of Michigan's Consumer Protection Division. He's also co-founder of 5 Lakes Energy, a clean energy technology consultancy focusing on enabling and accelerating Michigan's clean energy economy. Welcome, Skip.
Thank you, Liz. Good afternoon, everyone. To begin, I want to provide some further context and a broader framework for our presentation on line 5. Many of you, perhaps all of you, are familiar with the fact that the Great Lakes harbor a little more than 20% of all the fresh surface water in the world. Lesser known are the other metrics. The Great Lakes constitute 84% of all fresh surface water in North America and 95% of all fresh water in the United States. By any measure, the Great Lakes are the largest, most magnificent, most valuable freshwater system on the planet. At the heart of the Great Lakes, at the confluence of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan in the Straits of Mackinac, we find line 5, the twin 4.5-mile, 20-inch, 68-year-old pipelines that experts agree are in the worst possible place to traverse the Great Lakes or be in the lakes at all, and have a abiding consensus that today we would never, ever consider having open pipelines in the Straits of Mackinac. The state of Michigan has concluded, based upon the evidence that they have gathered, that the line 5 constitutes an imminent risk of catastrophic harm, not just to the Great Lakes, but to coastal communities, to the environment writ large, and to the Great Lakes regional economy, which, if standing alone, is the 3rd largest economy in the world. The presence and operation of the pipeline, as Liz said, violate the public trust doctrine. This is the primary legal approach that the state of Michigan, through its attorney general and the government and the governor, are taking to address this situation. The public trust doctrine holds that essentially that the waters belong to the public, that they are held in trust for you and I, and that government has a fiduciary responsibility as trustee to protect these waters from impairment or damage. So that's the basis for the primary action and legal approach on line 5. It's the basis for the revocation, the governor's revocation in November 2020. And in response to that, Enbridge has steadfastly refused to suspend the operation of line 5. So up until a short time ago, very few years ago, we didn't really know much about line 5. We forgot about it. But now we know a little bit. We have yet to have a comprehensive survey of the entire pipeline network in the Straits of Mackinac. But what we do know is that the pipelines are dented, they are abraded, they are gouged, they are deformed. They have lost their protective coatings and they're now bent to a degree that violate the minimum curvature requirements and wall thickness requirements set forth in the easement, the 1953 easement. And they are no longer supported in the manner intended. So this is a really important slide, and I hope you can see it clearly. In 1953, when the pipeline was first constructed, it was subject to detailed, comprehensive engineering analyses. There were 20 particular areas of analysis that looked at the pipeline and what it would encounter in terms of currents, in terms of pressure in different temperatures, vertical forces, horizontal forces, and things like that. Prior to its operation, those engineering analyses were reviewed and certified by Columbia University engineers, and the pipeline was determined to be fit for purpose. Now, importantly, fit for purpose meant a pipeline that was substantially buried, that otherwise laid on the bottomlands of the Straits and had very few spans, because of course the bottomlands are irregular and there would be spans, but they would be minimized. What has happened in the course of the last 70 years is that there has been substantial erosion and scour of those bottom lines. And as a result, and really late to the game, Enbridge has installed a series of 217 anchors and supports, saddle supports, to hold the pipeline. Now, what is the key important thing here is that these pipelines, approximately 3 miles of the pipelines are now elevated. And this configuration wasn't what was contemplated in 1953. The pipelines have many more failure modes, and because they're elevated, they're much more susceptible to impact from anchor strikes. So, predictably, the anchor strikes have occurred, at least the ones that we are aware of. In June 1979, we know that an anchor drag cut power cables, high voltage power cables from that were operated by Consumers Power. In 2018, a tugboat unknown to the crew dropped an anchor and dragged it for many, many miles across the pipelines, denting the pipelines in at least 3 places and severing power lines that were owned and operated by American Transmission Company, releasing some dioelectric fluids into the lake. In May 2020, based upon Enbridge's own report, there was another accident that impacted both pipelines, as well as almost dislodging one of the saddle anchors. Enbridge concluded that anchor strike or cable drag was likely attributable to one of the ships that were under contract to Enbridge that were doing operation and maintenance on the line, or geotechnical work for the tunnel. And then most recently, last week, we learned that another one of these vessels under contract to Enbridge doing operation and maintenance had somehow dropped a 7.5 ton anchor. As Liz said, we don't know what the circumstances are there. So there have been cable drags, chain drags. The pipeline that is now elevated, that has a much more complex design, is much more vulnerable to anchor strikes, as well as current induced stress, because the currents, which are very strong in the Straits of Michigan, affect it laterally. They change directions east to west. And one of the concerns by our experts is that these anchors, further erosion could free an anchor system, adding much more stress to the pipeline system. And then finally, this area is an area of high vessel densities. Ships pass all the time. And we know, and in the last 2 years, that freighters can lose power, they can lose steerage. And we have freighter accidents. And when they do, they will throw an anchor, even though the Coast Guard recently designated this area a no anchor zone. So there has been very limited risk analysis. In 2016, a risk analysis indicated that the risk of an accident was not 1 in a million or 1 in 10,000, but was 1 in 60. And that was a risk assessment done by Dynamic Risk, Enbridge's own contractor. In 2018, there was a risk assessment that conservatively estimated the damage from a pipeline breach or failure at 1.8 to 2 billion. That was updated by MSU under contract to Flow. Their analysis indicated that the damages would be could be in the approximate area of $6 billion. And that if there was a 2-week shutdown of the locks as a result of a pipeline failure, the economic damages to the region could be $45 billion. So in terms of legal action, there was the original action filed by the Attorney General based upon the public trust doctrine in 2019 that sought the preliminary injunction to stop the operation of the pipelines. That is being held in abeyance for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. A second suit was filed in concert with the governor's revocation and termination of the easement for the pipeline. That legal action filed by Dana Nessel seeks to enforce the revocation order of the governor. In response to that, Enbridge, by its right under federal law, removed these state cases to federal court, and also contemporaneously filed a new complaint against the state of Michigan, seeking a declaratory judgment that state efforts to stop the pipeline were preempted by federal law and violate the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. The state of Michigan, through the Attorney General's office, responded with a motion to remand these cases back to state court where they belong. That motion will be decided, we hope, early this fall, if not sooner. So one of the recent victories has been with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the tribes and FLOW and the Environmental Law and Policy Center, the National Wildlife Federation, and Oil and Water Don't Mix, submitted extensive comments to the Army Corps, indicating that the proposed tunnel needed to have a full-blown environmental impact analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act. And fortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers agreed. There are many bases for our request that a full EIS be conducted, but one of the most important is the geotechnical information that was developed by Enbridge's own contractors. Enbridge it represents to the public that this tunnel will be drilled through bedrock under the Straits of Michigan. Enbridge's data strongly indicates that there really isn't any or much bedrock at all. Using the classification system for rock that engineers use in this area, most of the rock is characterized as being very poor. That's a classification because there are karst formation and limestone and other things. It is not bedrock. The long and short of this is that the progression of the EIS will take a number of years, underscoring the necessity of shutting down the pipeline now. Another victory has been before the Michigan Public Service Commission. The commission has ruled that the scope of review, for the first time, any agency of the state of Michigan has ever so concluded, must include an environmental examination and a accounting of climate change impacts. Specifically, that means the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions associated with the pipeline, and not just the 4-mile section, but all of the petroleum that is transported through the pipeline. The commission also determined that the Michigan Environmental Protection Act applies, and as a result, there must be a determination of feasible and prudent alternatives to the tunnel, including a no-action alternative. So lastly, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy has already issued permits for the wetlands and water quality. In issuing those permits, curiously, EGLE declined to invoke the Michigan Environmental Protection Act and the requirements of that act. It also did not address in any way the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the impacts, and did not consider the geotechnical information developed by Enbridge itself in making the decision. Earth Justice, on behalf of the tribes, has contested this permit, and the resolution remains to be seen. So the second area that I want to address is the non-essentiality of Line 5. There are trends, the confluence of which indicate that Line 5 can be shut down, and in fact will likely be shut down by Enbridge by its own volition at some time in the future. And the reason is a number of factors. First, there's going to be a diminution of peak oil demand. Global sales of vehicles, light-duty vehicles with internal combustion engines peaked in 2017, and global oil demand likely peaked in 2019. We don't know that for certain because of the loss or the reduction in economic activity as a result of the COVID crisis. But even regarding that, most forecasters, prognosticators in the energy area think that we've already reached global oil demand. And there are many reasons why they think so, because all of the 16 largest OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, auto producers, have all indicated that they will aggressively transition to electric drivetrains. General Motors and Mercedes intend to exit fueled vehicles by 2035, Volvo and Ford by 2030, VW by 2026. We also have states now passing laws prohibiting the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles, light-duty vehicles. California and Massachusetts have already done so by 2035, and those states that have adopted California CAFE standards, corporate automotive fuel efficiency standards, are likely to follow California and Massachusetts, and the other states are likely to follow after that. 2 weeks ago, the European Union announced its 27 member countries will ban the sale of gasoline and diesel vehicles by 2035. More than 10,000 cities have committed to CO2 reductions. Metropolitan areas all over the world have schedules to prohibit the actual use of internal combustion engine vehicles within their confines, within their geographical areas. This has all caused EY, formerly Ernst & Young, last week to issue a new report that was accelerating their timeline for EV penetration. According to EY's report released last week, the European electric vehicles will outsell petroleum vehicles, diesel and gasoline vehicles in Europe by 2028, in China by 2033, and in the US by 2036. EY also projects that by 2045, less than 1% of light-duty vehicle sales globally will be gasoline or diesel. So in response to this, and importantly, in response to evolving climate science and what it is telling us in terms that there's a fundamental disconnect between continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure and what climate science is compelling us to do in terms of keeping temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. The corporate world has responded, and so has, importantly, the global financial community. So BNP Paribas is the largest bank in Europe, and last year it issued, and I wish I could get rid of the screen so I can read this because this is important. The economics of oil and gasoline vehicles versus wind and solar power are now in relentless and irreversible decline with far-reaching implications for policymakers. And Veritas Investment Research, Veritas Capital, advises governments all over the world, as well as corporations all over the world, on energy matters and investment matters. And they just 2 weeks ago issued a statement indicating, and I'm going to read this because it's important, Canadian oil sands assets with a price tag of $13.4 billion may be up for sale as oil majors divest their heavy oil assets in Western Canada. Okay, I got to move on. So what that means is that there is divestment in tar sand oils. Enbridge delivers 65% of these oils to American markets. This is a picture of northeastern Alberta, where tar sands are extracted and refined. This has been labeled as the most destructive and largest industrial project in human history. I'm running out of time, so I have to rush through these slides. But because oil sands are the most expensive to produce, the bitumen, which is a mixture of water, clay, and oil, has to be extracted through a process that consumes lots of energy and 5 times as much greenhouse gas emissions. It's expensive, and so as demand for petroleum products, and particularly fuels, diminish, the most expensive and costly production areas will be the first to be curtailed. But the financial community is doing much more. There is divestment that is occurring across the globe. As of 2020, over 1,100 institutions have pledged divestment in assets in 4.4 trillion. University of Michigan, about 8 months ago, announced they will divest from fossil fuel companies. This is happening very, very quickly. 6 years ago, there was only $52 billion in announced divestment activity. 6 years later, there's $14.5 trillion in announced divestment. Financial institutions have announced that they will no longer lend for coal and pipeline projects, including all of these, the largest asset management firms in the world's largest banks, the world's largest employee and pension fund are all seeking divestment. This is hugely important. These insurers have announced that they will no longer be insuring pipelines in the future, and they will no longer, because they have these insurance companies are very large and make large capital investments. They will no longer invest in pipelines and tar sand oil production in Alberta. So as a consequence, Moodys has downgraded the credit worthiness of Alberta's debt. And you may have saw last month or the month before that Canada's Supreme Court ruled in the challenge by Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario that the carbon tax that Canada is imposing federally is valid and will apply. So these are not good things for the future of tar sand oil. So just quickly, this is important because people may not be aware of this. Enbridge, the Canadian parent, has a consultancy that looked at this has concluded that there are at least 275 subsidiaries, and Enbridge Inc. is not a signatory to any of the agreements that were made with former Governor Rick Snyder. And moreover, the signatories, which are subsidiaries, do not have the financial wherewithal to respond. And Enbridge Inc. is not contractually obligated in any way to stand up if there is a failure of Line 5 and if there are damages that need to be rectified. In fact, in a legal proceeding a couple of years ago in Minnesota, Enbridge's chief financial officer testified in a court of law that Enbridge Inc. would not be responsible for any of the liabilities incurred by its subsidiaries. So the key point is, not only has Enbridge essentially said to the governor that it will ignore the governor's revocation and termination order, it has also said no to the governor when the governor and its administration asked it to provide financial assurances. It refused. So the one thing that we have going for us, and this is really, really important in terms of what we can do. This will be elaborated, I think, by Sean McBryde in his presentation. But we are in a politically polarized nation situation, but there are 2 areas of fundamental agreements that, between Democrats and Republicans that bridge that partisan divide. And those 2 areas are support for renewable energy and concern about water quality and water quantity. And we need to leverage that on an ongoing basis and communicate, across party lines to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and to shut down Line 5. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Skip. And Skip, if you could close your screen share, that would be terrific. Thank you so much. And I would like to now introduce you to Christopher Clark, who is supervising senior attorney at Earth Justice and represents Bay Mill Indian community. He joined Earth Justice Midwest's regional program in January of 2020. He works with the Chicago-based team to advance the organization's mission throughout the region. Earth Justice, in collaboration with the Native American Rights Fund, currently represents the Bay Mills Indian community and its advocacy and litigation efforts involving the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline. Prior to joining Earth Justice, Christopher worked for over a decade as senior counsel and then Midwest Regional Director for Lambda Legal, the nation's largest LGBTQ legal rights organization. In that capacity, Christopher successfully argued cases before 5 different state Supreme Courts in the Midwest region. Christopher obtained his undergraduate degree in public and international affairs from Princeton University and his JD from the University of Chicago Law School. He lives in Chicago with his husband, Victor, where they own an art gallery. Christopher, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Liz. And hello, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking Flo for inviting me to this presentation and thanking my fellow panelists and really thanking all of the organizations and individuals who are so actively engaged in Line 5 and for welcoming Earth Justice and Bay Mills and our co-counsel, the Native American Rights Fund, to this fight. You have been just absolutely wonderful collaborators, so thank you. I also wanted to start by extending the regrets of Bay Mills President Whitney Gravel, who had hoped to be with us today, but unfortunately she could not attend, so I'm stepping in for her. She is involved in the Red Road to DC event. So those of you who are not familiar with that, a 25-foot totem pole has been traveling across the country from Washington State to Washington, DC, making stops along the way for ceremonies with tribal communities. And the purpose of this is to honor, unite, and empower communities that are working to protect sacred places. And the totem pole itself is being delivered today to the Biden administration in an effort to encourage the administration to take a stand with those who are struggling to protect sacred places. And that totem pole will be on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian for a period of time until a permanent home is determined. So I send the regrets of President Gravel. Can we move to the first slide? I wanted to briefly introduce the organization, my organization, and the organizations I'm working for on the work with Line 5. So Earth Justice is a national nonprofit organization that has 14 offices across the country, 450 employees, and our Midwest office opened in 2019 in order to enhance the organization's work throughout the Midwest region. And we represent, as attorneys, Bay Mills in a various pieces of advocacy and litigation involving Line 5. And as an attorney at Earth Justice, I am very proud to have as my co-counsel attorneys from the Native American Rights Fund. We refer to them as NARF sometimes. NARF is a 50-year-old nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to Indian tribes, organizations, and individuals who might otherwise not receive adequate representation. And NARF is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, and they have offices in Washington, DC, and Anchorage, Alaska. And finally, Bay Mills is, as most of you I think know, a federally recognized tribal nation in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And the tribe has deep historic, cultural, and spiritual connections to the Straits of Mackinac and the surrounding Great Lakes region. And so Earth Justice and NARF, as I said, represent Bay Mills in its advocacy regarding Line 5. And the purpose of our collaboration is to really amplify the voices, perspectives, and concerns of Bay Mills and other tribal nations regarding Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline and the proposal to build a tunnel underneath the Straits of Mackinac. Let's go to the next slide. Bay Mills is a successor to the tribal communities that entered into the 1836 Treaty of Washington. And so the 1836 Treaty of Washington was a treaty in which indigenous people gave to the United States over 14 million acres of land and waters to the United States. And it was as a result of this ceding of land that the United States was able to create the state of Michigan. And in exchange for that grant of land, the tribes reserved the right they had to hunt, fish, and gather within the ceded territory. And the map that I have up here for you shows you what that ceded territory is. It's important also to when you think about the treaty right to hunt, fish, and gather throughout the region, that this is not a right to simply take something. Rather, it's a right to continue the tribe's relationship with the land, water, animals, fish, and plants throughout the region. And these resources throughout this region are intertwined with the tribe's way of life. They're part of the tribe's cultural and spiritual identity, and they also have economic importance. So I'll share with you that over 50% of the members of Bay Mills, for example, derive all or a portion of their income from commercial fishing. So the fishing that occurs in the Great Lakes is critically important from an economic perspective as well. I wanted to touch on briefly why treaty rights, why we're talking about the treaty rights, why they're so important in the Line 5 advocacy. Treaties are recognized in our federal constitutional system as the supreme law of the land, and states have an affirmative obligation to not interfere with treaty rights. And the tribe's treaty rights in the Great Lakes region that I'm describing would be meaningless if states or state agencies, or for that matter, federal agencies, could destroy these resources by allowing something to proceed that would have a catastrophic impact on those resources. So Earth Justice and the Native American Rights Fund, along with Bay Mills, are really raising the importance of the treaty rights and the treaty resources in the Line 5 fight. And I'll just highlight a few ways that is playing out. Number one, we are actively supporting the governor's decision to shut down the dual pipelines. And we filed a brief with the federal court that's examining whether that case should go back to state court. And we're supporting the return of that case to state court because the decision that the governor made to revoke Enbridge's right to operate the dual pipelines was made in part to protect the tribe's interests and their treaty protected resources. So we are grateful for the governor for making that decision, and we believe it was an appropriate exercise of her authority under state law to protect the tribes and their treaty resources. We are also raising the treaty rights and resources before the Michigan Public Service Commission. The MPSC is evaluating an application from Enbridge to build the tunnel underneath the Straits of Mackinac. And we intervened in that matter on behalf of Bay Mills, so we're actually a party in that case, to offer evidence and testimony to the commission that we believe is highly relevant to their consideration of whether they should allow Enbridge to build this tunnel. And in that testimony, we are going to be raising the impact that the continued use of fossil fuels will have on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And very specifically on behalf of our client, Bay Mills, we are going to be telling the story of the impact climate change is having and will have on the plants, animals, and fish that are a critical part of the tribe's way of life. So we're looking forward to developing that testimony and offering it to the commission in the fall. And then finally, it was mentioned earlier that the Army Corps will be conducting an environmental impact statement with respect to the tunnel that Enbridge proposes to construct. And again, I want to sort of lift up that was a big victory. An environmental impact statement is exactly what needs to happen. And that examination of the environmental impact of the tunnel needs to be comprehensive. And so we, as was mentioned earlier, submitted comments in which we asked for that environmental impact statement. And now that the Corps has decided to go ahead and do the environmental impact statement, we are going to be involved in that process and encouraging the Corps to have a broad review of the environmental impacts, and that broad review should include a consideration of the impact that the tunnel and the continued operation of the pipeline will have on the tribe's treaty rights and resources. Let's go to the next slide. What I'll conclude with is sharing another event that occurred in the spring, which was in May. The Bay Mills Executive Council, the governing body of the tribe, passed a resolution that banished Enbridge from the lands and waters of the ceded territory. Now, banishment is a form of tribal law that is exercised only when egregious acts and misconduct have harmed tribal citizens or threaten treaty rights and resources. And it is a very extraordinary remedy. In fact, it's the most serious action that a tribe can take with respect to misconduct. And this resolution was passed by Bay Mills to communicate the grave threat that is presented by Enbridge's conduct and the company's complete failure to address the tribe's concerns about how the pipeline and the proposed tunnel threatens their way of life. So this was part of our continuing effort and Bay Mills' continuing effort to make sure that as the advocacy regarding Line 5 continues, that we elevate the voices and perspectives of Bay Mills and other tribal nations. And the banishment was taken to make sure that those concerns continued to be heard. And with that, Liz, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It's fascinating listening to both you and Skip, and it is my great honor also to introduce Sean McBryde, who is our campaign coordinator for the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign and legislative and policy director at Michigan Clean Water Action. He works on water infrastructure, oil and gas, and drinking water issues. Sean has served as a leader in the campaign to decommission Line 5 for the past 6 years. He learned the importance of protecting drinking water and our environment from a young age, growing up in a community devastated by perennial droughts and poor water and air quality in California's Central Valley. Without further ado, Sean, I will turn it to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. If we could move on to the first slide here. I'm Sean McBryde, and as Liz said, I'm the Legislative and Policy Director for Clean Water Action here in Michigan, and the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign coordinator. And so Christopher and Skip did such a great job with the legal overview and where we are on Line 5, where we are specific, especially to the legal issues going on. But really the other side of what we're up against is what I'm going to address today. And there is, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm not going to try to dive into too much detail on this. There is a very common oil industry sort of playbook of tactics that we see them use in situation after situation. So the examples we're really going to be looking at today are what Enbridge is doing right now in Michigan, what they've done in Minnesota a little bit. But, this is really a playbook that there's not much original. It's been used by industries time and again, to push back against organized labor back in the late 19th and early 20th century. A lot of these tactics were used by cigarette companies to hide the truth about their products, just like the oil industry has tried to hide the truth about climate change for the last 50 years at this point. But if we can move on to the next slide, please. So Enbridge, is exerting their legal influence in court right now. And what they've been doing for several years is working to build and exert political influence. There's frankly, not many issues taking place in Lansing right now that reek of money and politics more than Line 5. The role of political spending in Lansing is much greater than it is in, unfortunately, a lot of state capitals across the country. Michigan is perennially ranked near the bottom, if not dead last, as far as governmental transparency. And that extends to lobbying as well as lobbying spending and political spending. So we can't always get a full picture of where Enbridge is spending political money. But we have been able to catch them in a couple things throughout the years that sort of pulls the cover back and lets us take a look at exactly what they're doing. Now, Skip mentioned earlier, a really great point that people all across Michigan, regardless of political party, people across Michigan and across the political spectrum really do value the Great Lakes and want to see the Great Lakes protected. However, when we put people in office, especially from, unfortunately, especially from one specific major party, we don't see their lawmakers voting that way. And that's largely because of the corrosive influence of corporate money in our political system. We see it in both parties, one definitely more than the other. And this is part of a much larger pattern, not only on environmental issues, but on a whole lot of different public interest issues where, the public's interests versus a giant corporation's interests. It's rare, unfortunately, to see the public win with the current Michigan legislature. So we're going to dive into a little bit of what Enbridge's tactics have been so far. If we can go to the next slide, please. So first off, they'd like to make a lot of big public charitable contributions that can be waved around to make Enbridge look like the good guys in the media. One example of that I know I've heard a lot about from our Oil and Water Don't Mix supporters over the years is their sponsorship of Michigan Radio. They're constantly a sponsor of Michigan Radio. And to be fair to Michigan Radio, they have a policy. I don't agree with their policy, but I also don't get to set it. But they don't reject corporate contributions. And also they've covered this issue pretty fairly. I don't believe that the sponsorship has impacted their coverage. What that sponsorship does do, though, is it guarantees that every time Enbridge is mentioned on Michigan Radio, they are mentioned as a corporate sponsor of Michigan Radio. And and then they use the language that Enbridge has given them for those corporate sponsorship advertisements about delivering safe, clean energy that Michigan needs. So it's a way of being able to sort of greenwash the truth about the organization. Another example here of one of their charitable contributions, they very publicly earlier this year had a big whitefish giveaway in St. Ignace, where they bought whitefish from one of the indigenous fishing groups, and they just had this huge whitefish giveaway, again, to ingratiate themselves to the community. One example from a few years ago in Kalamazoo County in 2017, Oil and Water Don't Mix and lots of activists down there had a resolution up in the county commission to calling on Governor Snyder at that point in time to shut down Line 5. And instead of voting on that resolution at a meeting in 2017, where that resolution was expected to be voted on, they instead received $45,000 for a brand new police boat from Enbridge. So Enbridge was able to influence the process there and push back their vote by a week at least. Another one that is rather concerning is Enbridge is a large sponsor of the Michigan Association of Counties, which is a lobbying organization that lobbies on behalf of Michigan's counties. And specifically, what Enbridge did with the Association of Counties is they became one of the main sponsors of the county commissioner training that Michigan Association of Counties puts on for new commissioners every 2 years. And so when they sponsored that training, they also did something at that meeting that was not on the agenda, and they wouldn't, they used the access that they're essentially able to buy here by ingratiating themselves to communities. But they were able to use their access to that training to put something on the agenda that wasn't there before, which was a resolution from the Michigan Association of Counties supporting the Line 5 tunnel, which they then passed by a voice vote. They didn't even bother to count the votes or to say who voted for and who voted against. But Enbridge is known for using tactics like that. If we can go on to the next slide. The next thing that they try to do, and all three of these steps we're going to talk about work concurrently. These aren't really in chronological order. Step 2 is controlling the media narrative. And when you're able to spend a lot of money on media, you are able to have a much larger mouthpiece than those who can't spend the same amount of money on paid media, especially in media markets like we have today, where there are very few choices left as far as independent print media goes. So in building the pro Line 5 campaign, especially after activists in Michigan, including all of our organizations, really started pushing on the work to inform the public about Line 5 and work to get it shut down, they started these what looked like grassroots efforts. We call them AstroTurf. A great example is Consumers Energy Alliance, which is an AstroTurf group out of Houston, Texas, that is made to look like a citizens group that is in favor of Line 5 here. And they also have a campaign to be in favor of Line 3 in Minnesota. Now, when you look into their funding as Consumers Energy Alliance, their major funding comes from all of the major oil companies, basically BP, ExxonMobil, several other major oil companies are the ones paying for these efforts. And part of the reason for that is this kind of a campaign to shut down an existing pipeline. If we're successful, this will be one of, if not the first time in American history that a oil pipeline is shut down by state action before a major disaster happens. So they're going to push back against this really hard. In building the Tunnel Coalition, they've made sure to include influential funders of both the Democratic and Republican parties in order to try to keep lawmakers in their corner. And then as far as their media buys go, Enbridge has started spending a lot more money since Governor Whitmer got into office. This year alone, we've been able to track in cable TV spending over $400,000 a month in cable TV spending alone in Michigan. That is not counting their online advertisements. That's not counting, I'll give a really terrible example. My daughter is in kindergarten, and when she was doing her school at home this year, they had a lot of lessons on YouTube. And whenever she clicked on a YouTube ad, a YouTube lesson, a lot of the time she'd get an Enbridge ad targeting, a kindergartner on school computer. So this is the 400,000 is just counting their cable buys. They do so many other media buys that are not really trackable, and that helps them build and control this false media narrative. And they don't have to worry about really being truthful in that narrative. They just have to get a message out there. And next slide. So the final step, after they've built this control by making contributions within communities and really emphasizing their influence there and controlling the media message, they now really work to divide and conquer communities and exert their influence in a larger way. So some examples here, Enbridge's reportable lobbying in the Michigan legislature. And so when I say reportable lobbying, very few lobbying expenditures actually have to be reported because we have very weak transparency laws. So this doesn't reflect probably their full lobbying expenses. This is just what has to be reported to the state. So in the last 10 years, They've reported over $580,000 in lobbying expenditures. Over 290,000 of that was in 2019 and 2020 alone. Since the Whitmer election, over the last 2 previous years, Enbridge had over doubled their reported lobbying expenditures. And in 2018, and here's where we caught Enbridge making a political contribution in sort of in an interesting manner, let's say. They, in 2018, donated $126,650 to the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. 3 days later, the Chamber of Commerce donated a very similar amount, around $130,000, to a group called Citizens Protecting Michigan's Constitution, which was the legal group that was suing to stop Michigan's redistricting ballot initiative. So they were getting involved in that, directly to influence the ability of a legislative majority to gerrymander in Michigan, and in favor of keeping gerrymandering. Another thing that they do, and part of the reason that President Gravel stated in Bay Mills's very strong statement when they banished Enbridge from Bay Mills territory, was she accused them of weaponizing indigenous culture, which examples like the whitefish giveaway, which is sacred to the Anishinaabe tribes, that Christopher's working with Earth Justice in these cases, and that have treaty rights in Michigan, giving away their sacred whitefish, as well as some of the things they've done where they try to buy tribal consultants to do different things. For instance, in Minnesota right now, they've hired one indigenous person as a contractor, and they love just pulling that out in the media whenever the rest of the tribal folks in Minnesota are protesting. Because they've built this incredible political influence, they get away with things that regular folks are not able to get away with. They're currently trespassing in Michigan, and in the question and answer, we'll get to that. We'll get to talking a little bit more about that, I think. And then in Minnesota, there's something that's really concerning, which, they're kind of a few steps further along in Minnesota and Enbridge is planning right now than we are in Michigan. But if we see anything that looks like tunnel construction a few years from now, we'll probably see a similar game plan at play. When the Line 3 expansion was approved, Enbridge opened an escrow account to fund county sheriff's offices for fighting pipeline protesters. So far this year, Enbridge has paid over $1 million to police forces in Minnesota to fight pipeline protesters and water protectors. And they've had over 500 arrests from that task force in Minnesota. They buy riot gear for them, they pay overtime, etc. Next slide, please. And so this is all to say their delay tactics here and Enbridge's political tactics to build, to divide and conquer communities and to build this political machine and exert force, works hand in hand with their legal delay tactics. As far as the 2022 election goes, if they can get somebody who's not Gretchen Whitmer, by using dark money and other things to win a governor's race in 2022, they're kind of hopeful this lawsuit will go away. So that's, at the heart of what Enbridge is trying to do with their delay tactic. The other reason why they're trying to delay is Enbridge makes an estimated $1.4 to $1.8 million daily from Line 5. With that many profits coming in from one pipeline, you can also see why they're willing to spend a very large amount of money to make sure the money keeps flowing here. So what can you do today is to take action. If we can go to the next slide. There's all sorts of things that we can do. We're never going to match Enbridge dollar for dollar. That's not what any of these organizations are about. We win by organizing, by building a broad public coalition and educating folks, having engagement, working on our engagement and building a base. In 2019 and 2020, before Governor Whitmer revoked Enbridge's easement, over 80,000 of her constituents called or wrote a letter or sent her an email asking her to do so. Next slide. So as far as ways you can take action today, sign up for FLOW, for Oil and Water Don't Mix, for Clean Water Action Michigan, get on our lists. There's going to be things coming in the Army Corps public engagement as we move forward with the environmental impact statement, Public Service Commission as well, and what's going on with Eagle. You can, if we can go to the next slide as well, some more actions that we're asking folks to take. We want people to see that there is strong public support for what the governor has done. The reason why Enbridge is attacking so hard in the press is they think they can win by doing that. So there's lots of other ways to get involved. If you can, please donate to organizations working on this. You can sign our petition to President Biden on oilandwaterdon'tmix.org. There's lots of other things that you can do, but please do sign up and be ready to help us as this moves forward, because we're going to win this, but we're not going to win it in the next 6 months. It's going to be a long time. So thank you all very much for your help today, and let's move on to the questions. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Sean, so much. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Skip. And if you could all come on to screen, that would be terrific. There have been just wonderful questions. And the one that we've heard prior to the webinar and also during the webinar today comes from listeners like George Goodman, from Mackinac Island, and they're interested in really understanding, how can it be that Enbridge is ignoring the governor's order to shut down Line 5? Who can enforce the law to stop Enbridge's intentional trespass in our public waters? And, can Governor Whitmer direct the state police to enter the facilities and shut it down? So, Skip and Christopher, do you think you can weigh in on that?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, the actions brought by the Attorney General on behalf of the state and the governor are essentially held in abeyance until the federal court judge rules on whether these cases go back to state court. Mm-hmm. And so this is essentially a functional paralysis on moving the legal effort forward. There are the active ways to otherwise enforce the revocation order are under consideration. It's just very difficult when you lack a judicial forum to make these arguments. So we just don't have the opportunity. The other thing I want to mention here is, and this comes across in everyone's presentation, this is David versus Goliath, even with respect to the resources of the Attorney General's office. They are strapped for finding expert witnesses and resources. Enbridge is not. The efforts before the Michigan Public Service Commission, before Eagle, before the Army Corps of Engineers, and in the courts that are supported by the environmental groups and tribes that you've heard about today, much of that work is pro bono, and we are scrambling to find experts to lend support of our efforts. So the problem fundamentally is jurisdictional, and that's what our court rules and statutes prescribe. And so we will make progress, but it's a long, torturous process.
Okay, thank you so much, Skip. Another question is to have a better understanding of leverage points at the federal government level, and that comes from Kelly Lively here in Traverse City from Senator Peters' office. Maybe Christopher, you want to address tribal and other federal connections?
Sure. I'll start with the event I mentioned earlier, where President Gravel is today, which is the delivery of the totem pole to the Biden administration as a place where I think organizing in communities is very, very impactful. And the impact of last fall's election and the openness, we hope, to more affirmative action from the federal government on Line 5 is there. So that is a good thing that is happening. I want to circle back to what we talked about earlier about the Army Corps process. So the Army Corps of Engineers is going to be evaluating Enbridge's tunnel application creating this EIS, environmental impact statement, and there will be opportunity for public comment on that. So what the Corps needs to do first is figure out what the scope of their environmental review is going to be. And then once that's determined, they're actually going to conduct the review. And at various points in that process, that will be open to public comment. And so certainly organizations like Earth Justice and Bay Mills and many of the others that have been referenced today will be submitting comments, but there will also be an opportunity for the public to submit comments. And that's important. You know, again, it is a David and Goliath situation, and it's very important that we be heard. We as a community be heard, we as organizations and individuals be heard. So I encourage people to stay informed about that process, and when the opportunity presents itself, to comment upon it.
Thank you so much. Another question, and I'll direct this to you, Sean, is where, to give our audience a better sense of where the Michigan legislature stands on this, and whether there are any key Michigan House or Senate committee chairs or lawmakers who are receptive to shutting Line 5 down.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there have definitely been some individual Michigan lawmakers who are very supportive of working to shut down Line 5. People like Representative Lori Pahutsky and Representative Padma Kupa, who were actually both at the Red Road to DC event, along with Senator Rosemary Bayer in Mackinac earlier this week. However, by and large, the legislature, has, again, money in politics plays a huge role here. And I'll just to be instructive on this point, one vote that happened earlier this year that was just a horrible shame. During the Department of Natural Resources budget approvals in the Michigan Senate, Senator Ed McBroom from the Upper Peninsula offered an amendment that basically said that if the state of Michigan loses the case against Enbridge in court, that the state will pay Enbridge's legal fees out of the salaries for the Department of Natural Resources. So a Michigan senator offered an amendment that would require the state to use taxpayer money that should be going to salaries of our DNR employees and use it to pay a Canadian oil corporation's legal bills. And that amendment was voted out in favor on a party line vote. Every Republican in the Michigan Senate voted in favor. Every Democrat in the Michigan Senate opposed that one. That's likely to get line item vetoed by Governor Whitmer should it make it to her desk. But that's the sort of vindictiveness we're seeing on this issue in, unfortunately, both the House and Senate at this point in time.
Wow, very striking example, Sean. Thanks for sharing that. We are rapidly getting to the end of this, but I can't help but I have to ask this question. A terrific one from Lisa Wyatt-Knowlton, noting that the huge global divestment in traditional oil is a compelling systemic issue that has significance. Is there any good way to raise this with Enbridge stockholders, perhaps via resolution on Line 5? Skip, but maybe you want to take that.
Yeah, so absolutely, that has happened with ExxonMobil with respect to climate change matters. It was shareholders' interventions that actually not only carried the day, but changed the configuration of their board. And again, that was in response to pressure from the financial community. All of this, everything that I've mentioned, all of these trends are really, they're not static, they're accelerating. The Danish courts last month or the month prior found that Royal Dutch Shell ordered them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think by 45% by 2030. This is a court taking action against a major multinational oil company to order them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which should accelerate their particular transition to more renewable energy investment. But by and large, the oil majors and fossil fuel companies, although they indicate that they are investing in renewable energy and clean energy opportunities, when you look at the balance sheets, thus far, with a couple of notable exceptions like BP and Shell, these investments are really only 1 or 2% of corporate expenditures. So they have a long way to go.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to extend my deep, deep gratitude to all of our presenters, Skip Press, Christopher Clark, Sean McBryde, and to all of you for listening in to this webinar. We will be following up with emails with a live recording, and we'll try to answer some of the questions that you posed that we were unable to get to. I hope that you found it as informative as I did. And I just want to leave you with this final thought, because it's important, and it's that, shutting down Line 5 and stopping this proposed tunnel will require all of us to stand with the state of Michigan in protecting our public trust rights. It's an incredibly historic moment. It's all hands on deck, because this is about protecting 20% of the world's fresh surface water before we see the unthinkable disaster in these sacred waters. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye-bye.